If you haven't checked it out yet, go to thechurchcrew.com and check out their website. Try it out for free. I think you'll like it. And while you're there, let them know how grateful you are that they sponsor Keeping It Young. Welcome to Keeping It Young podcast, conversations about marriage, family, and ministry life. I'm Dave.
And I'm Bethlie.
We are the Youngs.
I'm glad you're here.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. Hope you have enjoyed this series we've been doing on training our sons and daughters to become men and women.
Right. So we've just started with some introductory material.
Yes, we have.
Which took 2 whole episodes.
It did. And today we're ready to get started in the practical side.
Right.
How do we train our boys to become men?
Right.
And it is super important that we do a good job at this. Our generation is desperately in need for great men. Mm-hmm. And our sons, our children, God has given them to us to help prepare them for the future.
Right.
We're not just trying to get them out of the house. We're not just trying to get through this thing called parenting. We are responsible to prepare them to be the men and the women that God has called them, gifted them, and that God expects them to be in the years to come.
Yes.
So we're starting here with just our sons. And so all of you that have boys, can I just remind you to recognize that your goal is to train your sons to become men. Just start it as a goal.
Right.
What do you want? I want my boy to grow up and be a godly man, to be masculine.
Right.
And to accomplish God-given roles in his masculinity.
Yes.
That's our goal. That's what we want. And we really ought to be praying about it. Boy, we could start there. Moms and dads, you could pray about it. Say, God, give me wisdom.
Right.
I love that passage in James. If any man lacks wisdom, that's a Bible way of saying if I don't know exactly what to do.
Right.
The Bible says, let him ask of God, and that God gives to all men liberally, and he doesn't upbraid. He doesn't get onto us and get frustrated with us. And so you can pray about it. Moms and dads, you really should pray about it.
Yes.
Just really seek God about it. And then just go to train in several ways. Specifically, just some real practical ideas here to get you started. Maybe keep a list of the things you are teaching or are needing to teach. Now, we joked a little bit about people being OCD. I think it was last week when we were talking a little bit. But one of the things that helped me when I was especially, training our entire group, because we have 5 kids, it's easy when you have 5 kids to, overlook one of them or to, think that, well, we taught this one, so surely they picked up on it.
Right.
And yet each one of our children have to be individually taught.
Yes.
And I was preaching recently and I told something about training our children in just practical things like changing a tire. And so it was one day this week, wasn't it, that our daughter, to Charity, who's 14, she was like, just so you know, Dad, I don't know how to change a tire. And I reminded her that she did not need to point out my sermons to me. And, but she's right. Just because I taught, her siblings how to do that doesn't mean that she knows.
Right.
So we have to keep a list sometimes. We have to say, and sometimes in the business of our world, you have to think, what have I, what do I yet need to teach the children? What are some things our children ought to know that they don't know yet? And, we sometimes when you have larger families, you that are listening with larger families, you can feel like because you did such a great job with the first 2 or 3 children, teaching them, for instance, about purity, you can feel like, well, of course, our other children got it because they were at least nearby, or at least they were, sometimes part of it.
Got that trickle-down effect.
But the trickle-down effect rarely works.
Right.
Every child has to be taught. Every son you have has to be taught individually about biblical masculinity.
Yes.
And so specifically, maybe keep a list. I actually bought a journal when my boys were younger and just had a page for each of them. And every so often I'd write down a couple of things. I got to remember to teach, this son about that.
Right.
Or we got to work on this. And so you do it specifically. And as we've already talked to you, but it's worth our repeating a little bit. You do it in real life. Dads and moms, sometimes you feel like I don't have time to I don't have time to breathe, let alone take the time to teach my sons all these details or my daughters.
Right.
But remember that the point we made was that you just do it in real life. As you do, you make it a training matter.
Yes.
And how often are you doing things, and the culture we live in undermines this a little bit because we do things in a rush. I got to run to the post office, and I got to get to the post office because I got to get to here, and I got to get that done because I need to run here.
Right.
Moms and dads, one of the imperatives of our culture is that of our parenting culture is that we resist the world culture we live in to be in a hurry. Parenting takes time.
It does.
And to train our children in biblical masculinity and biblical femininity is just going to take time.
It will.
You have to slow down. And, you're changing a tire. It's a whole lot easier just to do it yourself than to take the time to say, no, this is how you leverage
Right.
This, and break that lug nut. This is how you put the jack. This is where it goes. This is where you find it. Mm-hmm. And when you're all done, this is how you put it all back. This is how you get the junk off your hands.
Right.
It takes just a ton of time. Even with daughters, and we're talking about sons here, but even with daughters, taking time to teach a daughter like to cook.
Right.
It's a whole lot easier for you to do it yourself. I've noticed that. It's faster.
It is.
But to slow down and say, no, this is how I make this. This is how I do this.
Right.
And there's two things I've noticed that happens in that. Tell me if you agree with this. When we take the time to slow down and do things with our children, things that we have to do, it's real life, but we take the time to teach our children in that process, let them point things out. It actually brings us closer to our children.
It does.
And it makes them feel like they're closer to us, doesn't it?
It does.
And so it's real life. And you do it with talking. This is dads, moms, if you're going to train your sons to be men, you do it with talking. You build them.
Yes.
You instruct them. You explain things to them.
Yes.
You praise them. And so there's just some practical, introductory remarks here to get us started.
Right.
And let's just jump into the outline.
Okay.
Some things we've outlined. And here's the first thing on the outline. You ready?
Yes.
All right.
So you should start early.
Start early. So your son's 3. He's not a man. He's not even close to being a man yet.
Right.
But there's no reason not to get started right away.
True.
And you say, what do you mean? How do you train a 3-year-old to become a man? Well, even with our boys, you remember when our boys were younger, every so often we'd dress up to go out to eat.
Right.
And well, what was I training there? Why would we dress up to go out to eat? Well, it was a chance for our boys to learn masculine manners. And one of the things I've always tried to do is from the very earliest, and I do this, even if the children aren't there, I try to get Bethlie's seat at the table.
Right.
And I don't do that all the time, but more often than not, I will
Right.
try to get your seat at the table. And I always had the boys be aware of that.
Right.
And the funny thing was I'd teach the boys, all right, boys, stand. Mom's coming to the table. So the boys would stand.
Yes.
And then as the years went by, sometimes it gets silly. Some of the boys would bow, or they would do a salute. And so there was a little humor in it, but the training was okay to be a little humorous there, but we were training that men respect women.
Right.
And you start that right away. A 3-year-old can stand at the table because mommy's coming to the table. And you start it with things like this. A gentleman would ask this, or a gentleman would say it like that.
Right.
And probably one of the things that we do in our culture is we tend to correct more than we train. I guess those can be the same thing, but they're often different, aren't they?
Right. Well, we just want behavior to stop.
Stop it.
Most of the time because it's annoying us. And
Yes.
so we're like, no, stop. Don't do that. Why would you do that?
Yeah, it's
Instead of,
right.
yes, this is how a gentleman would say that.
Right.
A gentleman would be behaving like this right now.
Yeah, and so, it's easier to say to your son, don't you talk to your sister that way?
Right.
Then you need to correct that. So we're not saying don't correct that.
Right.
But it takes a whole lot more time and effort and work to say, now, this is how a gentleman would respond to that. This is how a gentleman would speak that.
Right.
And make it masculine when you say to your son or daughter, or rather your son, because we're talking about sons here, when you say say thank you, a man says thank you.
Yes.
And a man, we always remember when we used to tell our boys when they were younger, before you leave the table, you have to ask to be excused at a meal.
Right.
And you have to say, thank you, Mom, for the meal, and I love you.
Right.
And do you remember that one time where our Josh, he was a pastor's wife?
He said it to a pastor's wife.
And she
Yes.
got all teary-eyed because
Yes.
her grandchildren are far away, and she was missing her grandkids and all of our kids at her table after we had a revival in their church. And so Josh, was done, and I had said something about, would it be okay if the children go play in the living room while we sit here and talk?
Right.
And of course they were like, oh yes, for crying out loud, we got toys. And so I said, I think it was my Josh, I said, Josh, what do you say to Mrs. So-and-so? And of course he knew just out of routine, because we do it all the time, he
Right.
said, thank you for the meal and I love you. She got so emotional about that. But you're starting early. You say things
Yes.
like a gentleman would say it like this. A gentleman would ask it like this. A man protects his younger brothers and sisters. My boys all, I tried to teach them that all the time, that, we wouldn't let the boys unnecessarily joke or tease with their sister, because the point I'd always make was she should always feel safe running to you at any given time.
Right.
Because you're the man.
Yes.
Or it's a matter of stand like this or speak like. In other words, you start early. Any
Right.
practical thoughts you would have from the mom's
And
side?
sometimes even from the time that you Maybe your little boy is a toddler or a preschooler and you bring a new baby home and it's his baby brother or baby sister. You can certainly give him those tools already to be the man in the younger sibling's life by saying, no, we're going to be very gentle with him. A man is gentle with the people around him. And we're going to be loving because the Bible teaches that men should be loving. And we're going to protect them. You don't want to hit your baby sister. You want to love your baby sister and protect her from other things. And so right away, you can start teaching them, even as a little one, to be a man, to be a little gentleman.
So the first thought we would give you, moms and dads, is you start early.
Right.
And so if you've got a little guy, you're training, and you don't have to be weird about it. And you don't have to expect your little boy to walk around like he's, 20 years old when he's 3.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is you're teaching, you're training, you're pointing things out, you're taking the time to explain better ways to do things. You've got to start very early preparing your boys to become men.
Right. And many of these things are relational things. It's okay for your boy to be rough and tumble, to want to wrestle and to want to run around outside, or to maybe make car noises when he's playing with his little trucks and cars. That's totally fine. We're not talking about you're going to have the little statue that just sits there and is a little
it's real life,
gentleman all the time.
Let them be boys, let them play, let them get dirty.
Yes.
And if your boys love to wrestle, don't think, oh my, what is wrong with my boys? They're not girls, and by nature they are designed with more energy usually, and physically empowering is important to them.
Yes.
And so embrace all of that, and dad, wrestle with your sons.
Yes.
And mom, don't get uptight about that. Let your boys do that. That is part of their learning early to become the man that God has called them to be.
Yes.
And one of the things that men have, I think, been gifted by God to do is to work at leadership, to want to be strong.
Yes.
And even start early preparing them for masculinity in other ways. Our boys would always notice that, Dad, you have hair. Dad, why do you have hair under your arm? Well, what a chance to take an opportunity for something that is natural curiosity to a little guy and prepare him for becoming a man.
Right.
And, sometimes we tend to either, ignore those kind of things or even turn them into a joking thing. And there's nothing wrong with laughing. If you know anything about us, you know that we laugh a lot.
Yes.
But to encourage your son to the fact that, someday you will, because someday you're going to become a man.
Right.
And I just always got a kick out of it because our boys became very aware of the fact when they started hitting puberty that I'm becoming a man.
Yes.
And that was important to our boys because we had prepared them for that early.
Yes.
So you start early. Any further thought before we move on?
I don't think so. And like we said last week, there isn't just this one type of masculine man that you're trying to turn your little boy into. You could have the little boy who is rough and tumble and he just wants to wrestle all the time and he wants to get sweaty all the time. Our Matthew, he loved to get the energy out. And then you might have another child who would rather sit down on the floor and line up all of his trucks by color. So it doesn't have to be, you're not looking for a certain type of manly man in your little boy. You're just starting early with, this is how a man would handle this.
Right. And I would even go one more thought on that before we leave that. I know that sometimes in our culture will say, oh, well, he's musical. And so then the culture around us will say, well, he's not like other guys. And sometimes the culture around us views different gifts and different guys as, that's more of a feminine type gift. But as moms and dads, it's very true that you may have one son that is, he's all about the physical, the strength. You may have one son that is all about the emotional side, the musical, the artistic side. In both cases, we are called of God to train them. The one will probably have to be limited, not to run over people, not to be a dictator, not to be harsh, not to be, what's arrogant or condescending. Aggressive. He'll have to learn to temper that into a biblical model of masculinity.
Right.
But a young man who has a tendency more towards maybe the softer side of things, like you remember in the Bible, Jacob was known more as a soft man and Esau was known more as an outdoorsy man.
Right.
But both cases, both men have to be trained. Right. Both of our sons have to be trained in biblical masculinity. A young man that plays music doesn't have to be feminine. He can be a very strong masculine. masculine. He can still learn to stand like a man should stand.
Right.
Treat ladies like a lady should be treated.
Absolutely.
He will also have to someday be a man in his own family, and he'll have to work hard. There's just times when one of the things about men is, the Bible teaches in Genesis, is that men have to work hard.
Yes.
So even if your son is a little more on the art side, he still has to learn to be a biblically masculine.
Right.
And just an aside on that, I have one friend, and he's older than I am, but he was telling me one day about his son, who really, I guess, is the word phenom?
He's a genius.
A musical genius. And when his son was quite young, he was cautioned by his someone who was training his son musically, and they said, "Oh my goodness, you have to protect his hands, and you really have to, he's a genius, and you don't want to mess up those hands."
Right.
Or
He
mess up
should
those.
not be playing sports.
And so my friend said, "You know what? I thought it over and thought, now wait a minute, my son is a musical genius, but he's also a man."
Right.
And so he automatically put him into sports.
Right.
And that young man grew up to be a very strong guy who is a musical genius.
Right.
And it's a beautiful thing to behold. He's using his gifts and talents in music, and has more musical talents probably than just about any guy I've ever met. But at the same time, he's very capable of dunking a basketball.
Right.
And not that, dunking a basketball, I can't dunk a basketball, so that obviously doesn't make you a man. But he's very capable of doing other manly things as well.
True.
So you start early. And then here's the second one. We have time we do. Let's jump into the second one here.
All right.
A second piece of advice about how do you train your boys to become men. This one is huge.
It's paramount, I think.
It is so important. And just 3 words. Get them working.
Yes.
God designed, you remember, if you go back and study, our Christian worldview says that we were made by God in the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
And God put man in the Garden of Eden to till the garden, to work in the garden, to plant the garden.
To till the garden?
Yeah, what did I say?
You said teal. It's okay. It's just
Teal
your
is a color.
It's
Teal.
your Tennessee heritage coming out. Teal it.
It is. And my Filipino friends always confuse me there too, because they say it that way.
Sorry.
Now I'm not going to say it wrong. We
Till.
till.
Yes.
There we go.
Till the garden.
We till the garden. And let me say there, we work in the garden.
There you go.
And
I just wanted to make it clear for our listeners.
That's awesome. And so y'all from Tennessee, y'all understood exactly what I say.
Yes,
Amen.
they did. They were like, why'd she even correct
That's
him?
exactly right. And so the point, though, you got to get them working. And in the Garden of Eden, he made a very strong case that work is essential to our life.
Right.
One of the reasons we have so many problems in America is that we don't have to work. And I don't want to say this incorrectly, but we have a large portion of our culture that are retired.
True.
And so they don't work.
Early.
Yeah. And so, they're done with work and they have money to survive and live, but, they don't have the purpose of work.
Right.
And one of the things we've celebrated in our culture is that our goal is not to work.
True.
And our children, if we're not very wise about this, our children can get the idea that work is a bad thing and not working is a good thing.
Right.
And, when you go to many cultures of the world where work is essential to survival. When I remember my first time ever traveling to the country of Haiti, I was amazed at people in Haiti. They start their days very early and they can spend every day, 7 days a week, just getting food.
Right.
The reason you're up working is because you're going to eat that day. And if you don't get up and work, you don't eat that day.
True.
And in our country, we don't think that way. No. We don't have to work. And if we fail in this area, daddies and mommies, if we fail to train our sons to work, we will, in many regards, many ways, we will cripple them for life.
Yes.
We will prevent them from learning some things that you can't learn apart from work. And, this is a big one, we will even open the door for idleness that often leads to many of the ills of our society.
Yes.
You remember in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the issues was obviously their moral perversion.
Right.
But one of the things that led to their moral perversion was an abundance of idleness. And so we've got to overcome that in the Christian family. We've got to train our sons to work. So don't
Yes.
underestimate how vital this is.
Absolutely.
Don't underestimate it. There's several things that work does, and list them for us there. What is the value of work in our sons' lives?
It teaches them discipline, it teaches common sense, it teaches people skills, and it teaches wage earning and life making skills.
And those are huge, aren't they?
They are.
Work will teach your kids discipline. And one of the things I've always enjoyed as our children grow up and begin to get jobs is the demand of the job. One summer, our son worked at Chick-fil-A, and his job that summer was helping to unload the truck that brought the supplies for the day. You remember that?
Right. And then he would do prep.
And he would have
Before
to
they
be
even
at work.
opened.
Oh, yeah. What
Yes.
time did he would leave the house very early,
Sometimes at 3:30 in the morning.
way before, daylight.
Right.
And there's a sense in which as parents we're trained to, I don't want our son to have to do that. He's 16. Oh, he's 17 or he's, whatever. But watching our son discipline himself to hear the alarm,
Yes.
to hit the floor, to get in the
Yes.
car, to drive himself to work, to clock in, and it's still dark outside, and there's only 2 or 3 people at work anyway.
Right.
And you got to get working right away. The discipline that taught was absolutely essential in him becoming the man that he is today.
Yes.
And so it teaches discipline. And I love this one. It teaches common sense.
It does.
And can you kind of explain that? How do you practically say that work teaches common sense?
Well, there are some things that a child who just sits around and plays video games all day long, they might develop some skill, because I'll just be honest and say there is no way that I could play some of the modern video games. I have no idea what to do. I don't know what button to push. I don't
Right,
know any
sure.
of that. So I understand it does take some skill. But there are other things that your child just can't figure out if they don't have a regular work schedule, even from a very early age, for you to be giving, and we're talking specifically about the boys in our home, for you to be giving them chores to do. And obviously, you're going to teach them how to do certain things. And there's obvious ways that you as a mama are like, I like it done this way. So you want it done that way. But it also just teaches them common sense. They have to figure some things out. Sometimes they're right in the middle of a job and mom's not available or dad's not available, and they have to think it through. And there could be times too, I know sometimes David and I may be going on a date. And so we'll say, hey, we're going on a date. We'd like you to do this and this and this while we're gone. And sometimes, the kids might have a question about it or whatever. And we try to be always available, but sometimes you don't hear your cell phone, you don't whatever. And it is amazing to me how many times I'll, see, oh, I have a text from the kids 20 minutes ago. And so I'll call and say, you guys okay? Oh, yeah, we figured it out. And so it just, whether it's something to do with the dinner that they're cooking, or maybe the chore that we gave them to do, or maybe even figure out how to run the washing machine. Maybe they'd never done that before. And so, oh, I figured it out, Mom, I got it. And I know today we have Google, so kids are like, oh, I can do anything. I can YouTube it. But giving them chores to do, giving them jobs to do, it just teaches common sense.
Absolutely. And common sense is very lacking in our culture.
It really is.
And it's because we have generations of kids that are growing up, and they're 18 or 19 or 20 years old, and they actually have rarely ever worked in their life.
Right.
And yet work has this great ability. It teaches discipline, and it does bring an understanding of common sense to where you know how to work through things, you know how to solve things, you know how to think things through.
Right.
It teaches you even people skills, how to work with
Yes.
people, how to how to interact with them. First of all, you're working with these people, and often you're in a team environment to where the whole team is either going to be picked up or pulled down.
Right.
And you learn how to encourage a person who's not quite helping the team. You learn how to tolerate a person who is undermining the team.
Right.
The people skill training that comes with work is huge. And don't underestimate the fact that work does, this is one of the reasons it's vital, it does teach wage earning and life making skills. God's plan for our needs being met really is one of 3 ways, I guess. Our needs are always met by work.
Yes.
We work, we earn, therefore the need is met.
Right.
It's also met by savings, as I make money and set some aside for things that I'm going to need.
Right.
That's one of God's ways to meet our needs. It's work, it's savings. And it's also true that God meets our needs sometimes miraculously.
True.
And we've seen that, especially in our ministry, in the sense in which we had a need and we didn't know what to do about it, and yet God put it in somebody's heart to meet that need, or We found something on a massive sale that, the sale that allowed us to be like, wow, that was affordable.
Right.
And we actually had the money, not thinking we were going to. And, is that a divine miracle? Well, some people in our culture will be like, well, miracles are overrated. But there's no doubt about it. For those of us who are believers, one of the reasons we believe in God is because of divine miracles.
Oh, yes, answered prayer.
But work teaches our children wage-earning skills. Like years ago when I first started in the ministry of evangelism, there was an older evangelist, and I was actually spending a summer working in his ministry. And it's one of those things when you start in the ministry, you're like, am I going to make it? Will anybody come to hear me? Will anybody schedule me? Is this really going to be possible? And I had said something to him one day about, what do you think? Do you think I'll make it as an evangelist? And his answer caught me off guard, and he said, first of all, dogmatically, well, absolutely, and I know why. And of course, all of a sudden I'm all ears. Why does he think that I'm going to make it an evangelist? And his answer was so practical that it's always lodged in my brain. And he said, well, the reason you will make it is because you know how to work. And can it be that easy? Can it be that easy or that simple rather? Can it be?
Right.
And yet there's a sense in which he's right. Like early in our ministry when we weren't necessarily getting the ministry opportunities because we were just getting started, we did fine. And the reason we did fine is because of work.
Right.
I remember when that one weekend I helped some folks put the roof on their house.
Right.
And I did, I did some substitute teaching in the school and just work. And one of the things about even as an adult man now having my own home, work is essential to that, knowing how to work. And having an RV. We lived in one RV. We lived in a fifth wheel for 16 years with our children.
Right.
So we were full time. That was our home, and we stayed in that full time. And then we bought our house. But one of my fifth wheels lasted 21 years, and we put about 500,000 miles on it. But the reason that happened is because my dad did teach me how to work.
True. And
being able, if I'd had to, every time we needed to work on the RV, move out of it so we could drag it to somebody to work on it, being able to just go ahead and live in it and right there in real life take care of it was because mom and dad did teach me how to work.
Right.
So mom and dad, you can start there. Now let's say somebody has a young child. Their son is 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. What do we mean by teaching a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old to work? Give some practical tips there as a parent.
Well, even a young child can help with chores around the house, and they can help with chores in the yard. And so as the mom and dad, are going through life doing the chores, think of things. What can they do? Can they dry these dishes? Can they help me fold the socks? Can they even just separate the socks? Saying maybe it's a very, very young child and you have a 2-year-old. You can say, hey, can you find all the socks in this big pile of laundry and put them over there in a separate pile for mom? And then play a matching game with them. And it's fun for the child. Absolutely. I remember our Charity, especially as she was getting to do chores, how excited she would get as she would get a new chore. And this is, of course, a girl, and we're talking about our guys, but being able to take over a responsibility, it was fun for her. And so it can be fun for your children too. And in the fun, you're actually teaching them how to work. Eventually, they will come to the point where they'll be like, no, this is just a chore. This is just work. This is not fun. Right. But then that's where you have those conversations of, you know what? God created us to work. Right from the very beginning in the garden, he gave us work to do.
And so as we come to the end of this particular episode, we're talking about training our boys to become men. The 2 lessons we've been talking about so far is get started early and get started early teaching them how to work.
Right.
And we'll pick up there next week. And next week we'll talk with you just more about this idea of teaching our children to work. Because as our children get closer and closer to adulthood, the work becomes even more important.
Right.
So we're out of time. Any last thought before we go today?
I don't think so. I think that was good. We're off to a good start.
All right. We look forward to your joining us next week here at Keeping It Young. And this week our prayer is that you will serve the Lord with gladness.
The Keeping It Young podcast is a Bax 5 Media production.